Hi, Bill Collins, Hudson Truck Driving School. We're here to help you prepare for your CDL road test pre-trip inspection. Remember, the test is divided into three sections. First, you do the pre-trip, then you do the backing, then you do the road driving. You need to pass each one of those segments before you're allowed to move to the next one. Okay? So, when you do the pre-trip inspection test, the examiner is going to tell you what he wants you to do.
So now remember, in terms of checklists, you are allowed to use this memory aid that the state of Wisconsin puts in the CDL manual. So you can use this during your pre-trip inspection test, and we highly recommend that you do that, all right? So that you don't forget to catch a section. Now, we also have in your training process this practice checklist. Now, the bottom line is you need to remember to point out every single item on this checklist and know where it is and know what to say about it. Now, it's important that you understand you don't need to remember the name of the component. You need to point to the component and give the correct explanation for what needs to be checked to determine that the vehicle is safe, component by component by component. All right? So, I am not going to use this during our video session because you're not allowed to on the test. I will be using this. Now, in addition to the memory aid, we are using pointer sticks here at Hudson Truck Driving School. Now, this isn't required. On your test, you're required to point to or touch. You do not have to touch components with the stick, but when it's easily accessible, we would recommend you do that. There are some components, as example, lights on the top of the trailer, you certainly cannot touch them from ground level, so you're simply pointing at components such as that, all right? But otherwise, do your best to touch the component. Now, remember that the test, when you're doing the pre-trip inspection test, there are 5 sections to the vehicle. And you can see that when you look at our practice checklist, because we have the front of the vehicle here, that's everything on or under the hood. We have the driver fuel area, that's from the hood to the back of the tractor. We have the trailer, the coupling devices, and then the end cap. So there are 5 sections in play here. Your examiner will tell you which of these sections you need to do. Everyone will do at least one of these 3, if not all 3. Everyone is going to do the connection components. Everyone is going to do the end cap. Okay? Now, the bulk of the pre-trip inspection has to be done at an 80% correct threshold. So you can miss a few things, but not a lot. When you get to the air brake check, which is the very last thing that you're going to do in the in-cab inspection, that has to be done perfectly in sequence. We'll talk about that as we go. All right. So what I'm going to do to start with is I am going to do a complete bumper-to-bumper pre-trip inspection. All right. You may not have to do a complete bumper-to-bumper. You may be allowed to skip some sections. You're not going to know what you're going to be required to do until the test actually starts. Again, the only thing I can tell you for certain is you'll do one or all 3 of these sections. You will do the coupling devices. You will do the end cap. For sure. Absolutely. All right? But what I'm going to do is full bumper to bumper. So I'm going to start with the front of the vehicle. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is start on the front of the vehicle. When checking the front of the vehicle, that's everything on and under the hood. I'm going to start with the lights. I'm going to point out both the left and the right headlights. The headlight lenses are clear. They're not cracked, broken, or missing. I have running lights and turn signals and 4-way flashers with this yellow bulb here. That area is not cracked, broken, or missing. Amber in color, both left and right. On the side of the vehicle, we're going to have our reflectors, but let me quickly mention that the lights on the top of the cab are not on the hood. So the lights that are on the top of the cab, those clearance lights, come into play when you're doing the driver fuel area, not when you're checking under the hood. So let's go to the side. So here we have the amber reflector on the front of the vehicle. Any commercial motor vehicle must have this amber reflector. Again, the lens is not cracked, broken, damaged, or missing. This particular truck does have a little turn signal light on this side. It's not required by rule, but do point out the examiner is not cracked, broken, or missing. Now, I do have fender mirrors on this truck. Most of our trucks do not have fender mirrors, but this one does. So if you have fender mirrors, you need to point out that the brackets are secure, the nuts and bolts holding it are tight, nothing's loose or missing. The glass itself in the mirror is not cracked, broken, or missing. All right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go under the hood. So I'm going to open the hood. These Freightliner M2s that we use for the testing process, the hoods are very easy to open. Some other trucks are much more, take much more strength to them. But this is a pretty easy hood to open up. So you're going to open this up from the examiner. And now you need to point out all the components that are in play on that practice checklist and in our red workbook that need to be pointed out to pass this test. So again, I'm using my memory aid. I've done lights first, reflectors. Now I'm doing engine compartment, all right? So engine compartment, the first thing that I would do is point out the oil dipstick. I'm checking the oil level to make sure it's above the refill mark. Remember, on the test, you're not going to pull it out and reinsert it. You just explain that's how it is checked. The next fluid that I'd like to point out is going to be my power steering fluid reservoir. This one is plastic. It has a high and low marking on it. I want to make sure the level is above the refill mark. It is securely attached. It's not leaking. The cap is on tight, and it is not leaking. The next fluid level that I'd like to point out is the coolant reservoir. To do that, the examiner does want you to walk over to the passenger side of the truck. So here we have our coolant reservoir. Make sure the cap is on tight, make sure it is securely attached, make sure it's not leaking, and the markings for the high and low are over here, and that's why one would need to come over to check that. While on the passenger side, the other thing that the examiner wants you to point out from this side is the alternator. The alternator is always on the passenger side. Sometimes it can be seen from the driver's side, but it's better seen from the passenger side, so it pointed out. So here is the alternator. You're telling the examiner the alternator is securely attached, the wires are securely attached, and these alternators are belt driven. You're checking the belt to make sure that the belt is securely attached, it's not damaged with frays or cuts, and it's properly tensioned, which means not more than 3/4 of an inch play at the center of the belt. Now, any components that are not on the checklist, don't worry about them. As an example, over here on this side, we have the windshield washer fluid reservoir. Now, you have to prove later on that you've got windshield washer fluid and that it actually works, but you don't have to point this out. If it's not on the list, don't worry about it. Let's go back over to the driver's side. All right, next I want to check my water pump. Now, on almost every truck, the water pump is directly behind the fan on the front of the motor. And what you are to tell the examiner is that you're going to check the water pump, make sure it's securely attached, and that it's not leaking, and then you do need to discuss the belt again. So the water pump is belt driven. The belt may be difficult to see, but you can find it there with your stick. You're going to tell the examiner the belt is properly tensioned, not more than 3/4 inch play, not cracked, frayed, or damaged in any way. The next thing I want to point out is the air compressor. Now, the air compressor is always on the driver's side of the truck. It may be towards the front of the motor, it may be to the back of the motor, depending upon what type of motor it is. On this Cummins, it is on the front of the motor. Again, hard to see, but that's where the air compressor is located. Now, it's extremely important you tell the examiner the air compressor is not belt driven. It is driven internally with either a gear or a chain. You tell the examiner you're checking the air compressor to make sure it's securely attached, making sure it's not leaking air or oil. Oil is pumped through it as a lubricant. So it's not leaking oil or air. Now, the power steering pump is always directly associated with the air compressor, so it would be behind it in this case. The power steering pump, again, must be securely attached, not leaking. It is not belt driven. So the power steering pump and the air compressor are not belt driven on any of these trucks. If you can't find the power steering pump, you follow the power steering hoses. So there are two hoses coming off the reservoir. One of them is going to go to the steering box. The other one is going to go to the pump. So you may not be able to find the pump, but at least you can follow the lines and point to where the lines go, thus pointing at where the power steering pump is. Now, we've talked a little bit about the belts. Make sure that you talk about the belts that are operating the water pump and the alternator, telling the examiner the belt is not cracked or frayed and it is properly tensioned, not more than 3/4 inch play at the center of the belt. In addition to that, you need to explain to the examiner you're checking all of the hoses. There are a lot of hoses on these trucks. This is a fuel line hose. That's a power steering hose. This is a coolant hose. This is a coolant hose. Now, you don't need to know what each hose does, but you need to point out hoses and tell the examiner you're looking to make sure that all the hoses are securely fastened, the clamps are tight, you don't see any cracks or frays in any of the hoses, and most importantly, they're not leaking. And of course, looking underneath the vehicle would be an indication of where to find any fluid that's leaking. So tell the examiner you're checking all of the hoses to make sure the clamps are on tight, they're not damaged with cracks or frays, and not leaking. Now, one last thing I need to check on this truck. This truck does have an automatic transmission. The automatic transmission fluid dipstick is located here. I'm going to tell the examiner that I am going to check the automatic transmission fluid with the motor running in neutral, pull it out, wipe it clean, reinsert it, and when I pull it back out, I want to make sure that the fluid level is above the refill mark. All right, now that completes checking the engine compartment. The next thing on my list are steering components. Now, the steering components consist of, first off, the steering box. The steering box, I'm making sure that it is securely attached. It bolts to the frame. So I want to make sure that the nuts and bolts are securely attached, nothing's loose or missing. Make sure the steering box is not leaking. Now, the steering box is steering the vehicle with three essential components: the pitman arm, the drag link, and the tie rod. Now, I'm going to go underneath the vehicle here in a minute to show you what this tie rod looks like from underneath, but this is where you're going to be pointing at it from, next to the left front tire. You're going to tell the examiner that where these components attach to each other, these components are securely attached. None of the nuts or cotter pins, cotter keys are missing. Everything is securely attached. Where the steering box attaches to the pitman arm to the drag link to the tie rod. Okay, and again, there are cotter keys in these castle nuts that attach these components with ball joints. So you're making sure that the attachments are secure, nothing's loose or missing. These components are not bent or damaged in any visible way. Now, what I want to explain, this is the tie rod, okay? So this is tying this wheel to the wheel over on the other side. That's how the steering is done. So that's why this is called a tie rod. And you see here again, there's a ball joint here with a castle nut and a cotter key holding it together. So you're not going to be able to, you don't want to get down on the ground like this to point this out, but I'm just trying to help you all understand what the tie rod does. It ties the two wheels together so that they're steering in unison, okay? That's the tie rod as a part of the steering linkage. All right, that completes my steering components. So now the next thing on my memory aid, steering axle suspension. So for suspension, I need to point out the springs, shock absorbers, spring mounts, U-bolts. So first of all of our test trucks have leaf springs. This is the leaf spring up in front. It is not cracked, broken, shifted. None of the leaves are missing. It mounts at the front, center, and rear. The front and rear mounts are called spring hangers or spring back brackets or spring mounts. The bolts are tight, nothing's loose or missing. If there's a bushing inside, the bushing is not damaged. The spring mounts in the center with U-bolts. So here's the top of the U-bolts. On the underside of the U-bolts will be nuts attaching them. The nuts attaching the U-bolts have to be secure, tight, not loose or missing. And then the shock absorber. This is the shock absorber on the front suspension. I check the mounting on the bottom and the top, make sure the mounting is secure, nothing's loose or missing. It's not leaking any fluid right here, and it's not bent. All right, after doing the suspension, the next thing on my list are the brakes. So I'm going to check the front brakes. The first thing I would point out to the examiner is going to be the air hose. Here's the air hose going in the front brakes. We are to check to make sure that the air hose is securely attached on both ends. The coupling is tight, not loose. And no air leaks in the air hose, no damage to it like cuts or cracks or frays. Now you do notice this little wire that is tie wrapped to the air hose. That is for the ABS sensor. That is not on your checklist. You do not need to mention it to him. Next, I'm going to show him the air brake chamber. Some people call this the air canister, but its proper name is the air brake chamber. Remember, you don't really have to identify it by name, just point to the correct component. And what needs to be checked on the air brake chamber is, first off, it's securely attached. The nuts and bolts are tight, not loose or missing. It is not damaged with cracks or dents, and it's not leaking any air. After checking the air brake chamber, then I'd like to point out the slack adjuster. This is the slack adjuster. Make sure that these pins are securely attached, nothing is loose or missing. And when pulled by hand, this is not supposed to move more than 1 inch. From the slack adjuster, we go to the brake drum and brake lining. Here is the brake drum, here is the brake lining. The brake lining needs to be at least 1/4 inch thick. There should be no cracks in either the brake lining or the brake drum. No grease or foreign debris on the brake lining. That concludes checking the brakes. Next, we check the tires. On the memory aid, it says tires here, but what that really includes is not only the tire, but the rim, the lug nuts, and the hub. So first off, in checking the tire, make sure that the tread depth is at least 4 30-seconds of depth of tread on the front tires. Remember, the rear tires are 2 30-seconds, but the front tires are 4 30-seconds. Tell the examiner you're checking the tread to make sure it's not worn unevenly. Tell the examiner you're checking to make sure that there's no separation of the tread or sidewall. Make sure there's no damage on the sidewall, such as cuts or bulges. Make sure that the tire is properly inflated. The proper inflation pressure is listed on the side of the tire. When you are checking the inflation pressure, it should be done with a gauge. You're not going to do that on the test. You explain that that's how it's done. And when you check the tire pressure, you're checking the gauge to the valve stem there. When you're done checking that, make sure that the valve stem cap is on tight and the valve stem is not leaking. Next, I would go to the wheel. Tell the examiner that you are checking to make sure the wheel is not bent, cracked, and it doesn't have any illegal welding repairs. Next, you are to check the lug nuts. Now there's 10 lug nuts on any one of these trucks. You're checking all 10 of them to make sure they're tight. None of the lug nuts are allowed to be loose or missing. The manual says look for shiny threads or rust trails. The important thing is you're checking each lug nut to make sure they're securely attached, not loose. And then you're checking the hub oil seal. There is oil inside of this hub to lubricate the spindle and bearings. We want to make sure that it's not leaking. You do not have to talk about removing the cap to check level. All you're doing is telling the examiner you're checking to make sure this is not leaking. And then these little nuts and bolts hold the hub seal together, make sure there's no leaking, and that all of those nuts are tight. Nothing is loose or missing. All right, so now I have finished checking the front of the vehicle on and under the hood, and now the examiner is going to give me the instruction on what to do next. So I am now going to close the hood and we'll move on. All right, so next I'm going to do what's called the driver fuel area. The driver fuel area is everything from the hood on back all the way to the back of the tractor. It does not include coupling components. That's a separate section. So the first thing I'm going to point out when talking about the driver fuel area is the driver door. I want to make sure that the driver door opens and closes latching securely. I want to make sure that the hinges are operating properly. It's a good idea to explain to the examiner that you'd pull up on the bottom of the door to make sure the hinges are secure. And the examiner also wants you to mention that the seal should be intact so that you don't have a big draft of air going in or out as you drive down the road. So that's the driver door. We have mirrors on the side of the door. We want to check the brackets, make sure they're securely attached. Nothing's loose or missing in terms of the brackets or the way the mirror is attached to the piping here. Make sure that the mirrors are not cracked, broken, or missing. Now I also have lights on the front of the vehicle. They are at the top of the cab. So what you want to do is point out these clearance lights at the top. Again, you're not going to be able to touch them, but point to them best you can. Tell the examiner you're checking the clearance lights. They need to be amber in color. The lenses need to be not cracked, broken, or missing. Next, I'm going to talk about the fuel tank. Tell the examiner that you're checking the fuel tank to make sure it's securely attached. These straps could break conceivably, so you want to make sure the straps are tight, it's securely attached, it's not dented, it's not leaking, the cap is on tight, and it's not leaking. In addition to that, most of these trucks these days have what we call the DEF tank. DEF is an acronym for diesel exhaust fluid. It is used as a part of a pollution control device. Tell the examiner the same thing about the DEF tank that you told him about the fuel tank. Securely attached, not cracked, broken, or dented, not leaking, cap is on tight, the cap is not leaking. Next, I'm going to talk about the step going into the truck. The steps need to be securely attached and free of debris so as to not interfere with getting in and out of the truck. Now, if a truck had a catwalk, this truck does not, but the catwalk would be in this area, allowing a driver to stand in this area to hook up the trailer connections. This truck doesn't have one, so you do not need to mention it. The next thing I want to discuss with the examiner is where the battery is, to make sure the battery is securely attached. Now, on most of these Freightliner M2s, the battery is right behind this little door, but on this particular truck, the battery is in this box back here. Now, you do not need to open it. You simply tell the examiner you're checking the battery box, make sure it's secure, everything's attached, nothing's loose or missing. If you did check the battery, you'd make sure that the connections are on tight, there's no corrosion. Now, the next thing I want to discuss with the examiner, under the vehicle it lists drive shaft, exhaust, and frame. And because of the position of the battery box and where the exhaust is, I'm best off showing him from the passenger side. So let's go over there. All right, so now over here on the passenger side of the truck is where I can best see the exhaust system on this vehicle. We're checking the exhaust to make sure that all of the attachments are secure, nothing's loose or missing. It's extremely important that nothing is leaking. We don't want any leaking of exhaust up into the cab. So you're looking for soot or any other indication that there might be leaking exhaust. So that's a really important component, checking to make sure the exhaust is not leaking. Now they want us to check the frame and the cross members. You're checking the frame to make sure it's not bent or cracked, cross members not bent or cracked, and securely attached with the bolts. None of the nuts and bolts are loose or missing. And then the drive shaft. The drive shaft is going to be in the center of the vehicle, going from the transmission to the rear end. You're checking the drive shaft to make sure everything is securely attached, it is not bent, and there are not any foreign debris in the U-joints here on the drive shaft. All right, the next thing I want to do is point out the suspension components on the rear of the truck. So we're going to look down in underneath the rear axle here. All right, now this truck has a torque arm. A torque arm and a spring are essentially the same thing. You're checking the torque arm here to make sure it's not cracked, bent, broken, and securely attached. This is the front mount for the torque arm. The nuts and bolts are secure, nothing's loose or missing. The torque arm attaches to the axle with U-bolts. That's one of the U-bolts back there. The U-bolts are securely attached, they're not broken, nothing's loose or missing. Now what we need to do is go to the back of the truck to point out the airbags on this vehicle. Now in order to get a look at the airbags, we have to come to the back of the truck. So this truck does have air ride suspension. That is the airbag. You can actually see the word Goodyear on it. It's rubber. You're checking the bag to make sure it's not damaged with cuts. It's not leaking. Now the airbag is going to mount at the top and the bottom. That would be your mounting for the airbag. Make sure all of these mounting points, everything is securely attached. None of the nuts and bolts are loose or missing. There's no crack or damage to those mounting points. Now again, this truck does have an air ride rear suspension. Some trucks do not. Most of our trucks do. Most of the trucks do have torque arms. Some of them have springs. We explain that in class. If you have any questions about what the difference between a spring and a torque arm is, please ask an instructor. It's conceivable to have a truck with airbags only, torque arms only, springs only, or a combination of any one of those three things. So it's real simple. You just want to make sure whatever suspension components you have, they are securely attached, right? So next we're going to talk about the rear brakes. Here's the air hose. It's the same description as up in the front. Checking the air hose to make sure they're securely attached, there's no damage to the hose like cracks or frays, and they're not leaking. Air brake chamber securely attached. It mounts on the other side here to brackets. Make sure that it's securely attached. The clamps are tight. There's no cracks or dents, and it's not leaking any air. Now the slack adjuster push rod coming out of the back of the air brake chamber on the rear axle. You're checking to make sure all of the components are securely attached, nothing's loose or missing. When pulled by hand, the slack adjuster push rod cannot move more than 1 inch. Now on the rear brakes, you do need to tell the examiner that to do this, you have to chock the wheels and release the parking brake. The brake drum and the brake lining, same thing that you check up front. Make sure that you have at least 1/4 inch of brake lining material. There's no cracks in the drum or lining, and there are no foreign debris, especially grease, on the brake lining. Now, as you can see as you watch this video, that these components on the rear of the truck are very difficult to see. They're hard to see, and in some cases you can't even see them. What you have to do on your test is prove to the examiner you know where they are. So even if you cannot see them specifically, at least you're pointing at the correct location of them and providing the correct information as to what needs to be checked. Checking the rear tires. We're checking the tread depth on the rear tires, a minimum of 2 30 seconds. So remember, 4 30 seconds minimum tread depth on the front tires, 2 30 seconds minimum on the rear. Checking the tread to make sure it's not worn unevenly. Checking for separation of the tread to the sidewall or any separation in the sidewall itself. Making sure the sidewall is not damaged with cuts or bulges. Checking tire inflation pressure. That is, again, checked with a gauge. You're not going to do it, you're going to explain it. Checking to make sure proper inflation pressure, the proper pressure for the tires listed on the tire someplace. You're checking the valve stem to make sure that the cap is on tight and that the stem is not leaking. Next, I'm going to check my wheels. I'm checking the wheels to make sure they're not dented, cracked, and have no illegal welding repairs. Next, checking my 10 lug nuts. Check each lug nut, make sure they're securely attached, nothing's loose or missing. Look for signs of looseness such as shiny threads or rust trails. Hub oil seal. Now, this hub oil seal is mounted to a plate. There are 8 bolts holding it, so these 8 bolts need to be securely attached, nothing's loose or missing, and it's not leaking any grease out of the rear hub. The rear wheels have a separation. These are bud wheels that are self-separating. You are to check to make sure these tires are not touching and there's no foreign debris between these tires, like a rock or something. The final section on checking the rear of the vehicle is going to be your mud flaps and lights and reflectors on the rear of the vehicle. Now, the mud flaps, also called splash guards, have to be securely attached and not broken or damaged. These will actually break in the wintertime sometimes when it gets real cold. So you make sure they're intact. Now there's reflectors required in two places on the back of a tractor. One is right here, so you have your DOT red and white reflective tape here, also called conspicuous tape. So the tape is not missing and is securely attached and clearly visible. So the other requirement in terms of reflectors on the back of a tractor, you must have white reflective material on the back of the tractor, both vertically and horizontally. It could be, in this case, a plastic reflector, or up here, white reflective tape. Doesn't matter which, and you can mix and match as has been done on this tractor. But white reflective material, vertically and horizontally, on both sides of the rear of the tractor cab. And then finally, lights and reflectors on the back of the tractor. They have to be red in color. Lenses are not cracked, broken, or damaged, or missing. All right, following our memory aid, we've completed the driver fuel area of the truck. The next thing on the memory aid are the coupling devices, truck and trailer. So, first thing we want to do is point out where the air hoses are attached to the rear of the tractor. These are permanent fittings. They are not driver adjustable. These fittings need to be securely attached, no leaking. The electrical line in this tractor does have a removable plug. It is properly inserted all the way. It is latched and intact. Then you are checking the hoses to make sure that the air hoses are not cracked or frayed and not leaking any air. You are checking the electrical line to make sure that the electrical line is not cracked or frayed and not spliced. You're not allowed to cut it and put it back together. You want to make sure that the air hose glad hands are securely attached. This is the emergency line closest to the driver's side. This is the passenger line, it's blue. You want to make sure these glad hands are securely attached and most importantly, not leaking. There is a rubber grommet inside of here. You don't have to remove it or even talk about it, but it's important that the glad hand is not leaking. And then the electrical cord, as it attaches into the tractor, must be fully inserted, latched properly with this little latch so as to prevent it from falling out. It's important that these springs hold these hoses and airline above the catwalk so that as the vehicle turns, they're suspended and not getting caught or cut. This one should actually be pulled up just a little bit to make sure it's off the surface here completely. Next thing I want to point out are the mounting bolts to the fifth wheel assembly. So if we look in here, these bolts are mounting the fifth wheel assembly to the frame. So all these bolts need to be securely attached, nothing's loose or missing. The next thing I want to point out is the platform. Now this is the platform, this little riser that brings up the mounting point to the fifth wheel. You're checking the platform to make sure it's not cracked or bent, not damaged structurally in any way. There is a pin right here that attaches the fifth wheel. The pin needs to be in place and not damaged. Now let's go to the release lever. This is the release lever for the fifth wheel. Make sure that it's all the way in the secure and locked position. It's not pulled out, it's all the way in. Now the apron is the underside of the trailer. We want to make sure that this apron is not bent or cracked and properly lubricated. You can see the grease up here. The skid plate is the top of the fifth wheel, which we can't see because the trailer's on top of it. But you want to check the skid plate of the fifth wheel, make sure it's not cracked, bent, broken in any way, and it is properly lubricated. Two more things we need to point out on our coupling components. The kingpin on the trailer, you're not going to be able to see it because it's inserted inside the fifth wheel, but you need to talk about the kingpin, make sure that it is not bent or cracked. And then the locking jaws, you want to make sure that the locking jaws are locked securely around the kingpin. Now, when you're working for a trucking company, you would literally scooch underneath here and look up into the throat of the fifth wheel to make sure those jaws are locked. Now, we can show you video, but on your test, please do not crawl underneath the truck. There's too much of a risk of hitting yourself in the head, knocking yourself silly, or cutting your head open. So do not go underneath the truck. Simply talk about it, put your pointer stick in, and explain how you would do it once you're on the job and covered by workman's compensation insurance. So next we're going to do the trailer. We've completed the connection components. And first let's talk about the lights and reflectors. So on a trailer, we're required to have clearance lights up at the top. They have to be amber in color. The lenses are not cracked, broken, or missing. Now, there also needs to be a yellow or amber reflector on the front of the trailer. It can be at the top or bottom, it doesn't matter. This one has the reflector down at the bottom. The trailer must have this reflective tape all the way down the side, covering 50% of the trailer. It's red and white, they call it DOT tape. So the trailer is properly marked with 50% of the trailer having the red and white reflective tape. Now, this light is not required on a trailer less than 30 feet. This is a 28-foot trailer, so this is not required, but point out that this is the side signal light, amber in color. The lens is not cracked, broken, or missing. On the side rear of the trailer, there is a required red light. The red light, the lens is not cracked, broken, or missing. The amber light on the back of the trailer on the side is an ABS light. When the light is off, that means the ABS is functioning. If the light is on, that means there is a malfunction to the ABS system on the trailer. Again, amber in color, lens not cracked, broken, or missing. There'll also be a reflector associated with this rear light, red in color. In the back of the trailer, there is red and white conspicuous DOT tape again. It's not required to be in both places, it's required here, but quite frequently they duplicate it and put the tape twice, as this trailer has done. White reflective material also required vertically and horizontally at the top of the trailer, just the same as on the back of the tractor. Lights are all red in color. There are some situations where a signal light can be amber, but brake and tail light four-way flashers must be red in color. The lenses are not cracked, broken, or missing. At the top we have the red clearance lights. Again, lenses not cracked, broken, or missing. The last thing on the rear of the trailer in terms of lights is going to be our license plate light. It is white. Lens not cracked, broken, or missing. That completes our lights and reflectors on the trailer. Now let's go back up to the front of the trailer and talk about the bulkhead. Now the front of the trailer, oftentimes referred to as a bulkhead, and that specifically is talking about a front protecting component on the front of a flatbed trailer. We typically don't call this the bulkhead at the front of a van trailer, but you can call it that, doesn't matter. What's important on the front of the trailer is you're checking it for damage. Make sure there are no protrusions, no dents from the inside out. Make sure none of these rivets are loose or missing. And then we should check the frame of the trailer. Now, there are different ways to construct a trailer. Frequently, this cross member, this side member here is a part of the trailer frame. And then you are going to have cross members. As we go a little further back here, you'll see underneath we have these cross members going across. This one does also have a longitudinal box to it. So whatever configuration you have, you're checking the metal components, make sure it's not structurally damaged with cracks or breaks, and that all of the attachment points are secure. Nothing's loose or missing. Landing gear, make sure that the landing gear, first of all, is in the fully raised position. Make sure the crank handle is secured, not hanging loose. And you're checking these support beams here of the landing gear. Make sure that nothing is bent, cracked. The mounting attachment points are all secure, nothing's loose or missing. All right, now if you look at your memory aid, it talks about tandem release. On the longer trailers with tandem axles, the axles are adjustable in their position, and that's what the tandem release refers to. None of the trailers we're using for your test are going to have those releasing axles or adjustable axles. So don't worry about that for your test, and we will show you the proper way to adjust axles at a different point in your training. All right, let's talk about rear suspension. Now, as I mentioned to you on the rear of the truck, the suspension components are difficult to see. They're even more difficult on this particular truck with all of the structural components here. Let's go back and see what we can see in the rear of the truck. All right, now in the rear of this trailer, you see we have airbags. That's the one thing we can see on the rear suspension clearly. As discussed with the back of the tractor, check the airbags, make sure they're not cut or torn and not leaking any air. Check the mounting points, both bottom and top. Make sure everything is securely attached, nothing's loose or missing. Now the one thing we can see back here in the rear of the trailer are the shock absorbers. Again, securely attached top and bottom, not leaking, not bent. So the mounting from the airbag to the axle is again done with U-bolts. The U-bolts are securely attached, nothing's loose or missing. And this torque arm, we could call it, is securely attached to the frame up there. Nothing's loose or missing, nothing cracked or visibly damaged. In terms of brakes on the rear of the truck, here are our air hoses. Securely attached both ends, no leaks, no cuts, no frays. Air brake chamber, we're looking at the back side of it here. Again, clamps tight, no dents or cracks, not leaking any air, and securely attached, nothing loose or missing. Push rod and slack adjuster, we can see the push rod clearly on the rear here. These mounting points mounting the slack adjuster, the push rod, nothing's loose or missing, the cotter pins are in place. Slack adjuster pulled by hand, can't move more than 1 inch. Remember, on the rear of the truck and on the trailer, in order to check slack adjustment, you have to chock the wheels, release the brakes. Pull by hand, cannot move more than 1 inch. Brake drum brake lining on the inside, not less than 1/4 inch thick. No cracks in the drum or lining. No foreign debris, especially any wheel seal leaking on the brakes. Checking the tires on the trailer, again 2/32 minimum tread depth. Checking the tread, make sure it's not worn unevenly. Checking to make sure there's no separation between the tread and sidewall. Make sure there's no sidewall separation, no cracks or bulges in the sidewall. Make sure it's properly inflated. Checking the inflation pressure with a gauge. Inflation pressure is listed on the side of the tire. When you check the tire pressure, make sure that the valve stem cap is on and not leaking. Next, I want to check the wheel. Make sure the wheel is not cracked, not bent, and has no illegal welds. Lug nuts, 10 of them, making sure they're all securely attached, nothing's loose or missing, looking for shiny threads or signs of rust trails. Hub oil seal, make sure that there's no leaking of grease in the seal here. These nuts holding the hub together are secure, nothing's loose or missing. And if you can see the level in there with a plastic hub seal like this, it's good to check the fluid level, but that's really a mechanic's job. Your primary responsibility is to make sure it's not leaking. And then in any case with dual wheels, have to be properly separated. Again, this has bud wheels that creates the separation. Check in between, make sure that there are no foreign objects lodged in between the wheels, and that the two tires are not touching each other. On the rear of the vehicle, check your doors to make sure the doors are securely attached. I don't want you opening them, but make sure you point out to the examiner that the doors are securely attached. It appears that the hinges are secure, they're not broken or cracked, and all securely attached. You check your mud flaps, again sometimes called splash guards. Make sure that it is securely attached to the bracket, nothing's loose or missing there. The mud flap is intact in its entirety, not broken, and it doesn't have any missing pieces.
All right.
So that wraps up the external inspection. Next on our list is do the in-cab. Now, first off, remember, anytime you get in the truck, you are using 3 points of contact. You could fail the test for jumping out of the truck. So make sure you're holding on with both hands, always facing inward. Now, the first thing the examiner wants you to do in the in-cab process is check that all of the lights work. Now, we use different examiners. Some examiners would prefer that you get in and get out and physically check all the lights yourself. Other examiners will have you operate them from inside, yell out the window, is this light working, is that light working, etc. All right? So, the bottom line is we got to check all of these lights to make sure that they're working. Now, using the system of having the examiner help you, I would get in the truck with the window down. I'm going to put the lights on and I'm going to ask the examiner, could you go up and check to make sure my left and right headlights are working? He'll go up there and give me a thumbs up. I'll turn the key on and I'll ask him to check the left signal up in front, the right signal up in front. I'll put the high beams on, ask him to check left and right high beam. I'll put the four-way flashers on, ask him to make sure that those are working. I'll ask him if the clearance lights are working on the top of the cab. I'll ask him if the clearance lights are working on the back, on the front of the trailer. I'll ask him to go behind the tractor and I'll ask him, are my running lights working on the back of the tractor? Are my left signal, my right signal? Is my four-way flasher working on the back of the tractor? Are my brake lights working on the back of the tractor? And then I'll ask him, okay, would you go all the way to the back of the trailer, sir? And then of course I'm going to have to yell pretty loudly. Are my running lights working back there? Are my clearance lights working back there? Is my left signal working? Is my right signal working? Are my four-way flashers working? And are my brake lights working? Is my license plate light on? So you have to be able to call out all of these lights for the examiner, and you could get in and out and do it that way, or call it out from in the cab to the examiner, defer to whichever way the examiner wants you to do it. After you've completed the external light check, then the examiner will come over, get in the truck with you, and you continue with the in-cab inspection. All right, now, continuing on our in-cab inspection, the first thing we should do is put our safety belt on. So you put the safety belt on, tell the examiner that you're checking to make sure it latches securely, that is securely mounted over on your side over here. All of the attachment points are secure. You're checking the belt, make sure it's not frayed or cut. Next we do a safe start. Now we're using an automatic transmission for this video. Now to do the safe start, you're making sure that the parking brakes are on, you're covering the brake with your foot, make sure it's in neutral, it'll default to that. And then when you start the truck, you should see a little ABS light there real quick that goes on and off. You need to tell the examiner that you have checked that to make sure that the ABS is working correctly. All right? Okay, now what we'll do is we'll check our lighting indicators. I want to put the left signal on, point out that the left indicator is working, put the right signal on, point out the right indicator is working, put on the four-way flashers, point out both indicators are working, and by putting the headlights on in high beam, show him that the high beam indicator is working. So that's my lighting indicators. I also want to check my oil pressure. The oil pressure gauge is working. It's not at zero, it's showing some pressure. This will change as the vehicle warms up, but the important thing is the gauge is working and there's not a red light. If there was a red light, that would indicate a problem with low oil pressure. Water temperature, checking the water temperature gauge. Again, it's working because it's up off of zero, and the important thing is that it is not displaying a red light. The red light is not on, and that means the water temperature is okay. Our fuel gauge over here also has our DEF gauge. Remember we talked about the DEF tank when we were talking about the outside inspection? Now the examiner wants you to point out that the DEF gauge is in the green, which means you have sufficient DEF fluid to drive down the road without any problems. The air pressure gauges, in any truck there's either going to be two gauges or a single gauge with two needles. Most of our trucks have two gauges. You're checking the air pressure gauge to make sure it's functioning, which means the needle is up off of zero, and we will be checking that to make sure that we're not losing any air pressure later. Now right in the center on this truck is where the voltmeter or amp meter gauge is. These are 12 volt systems, so it has to be reading something above 12, preferably in the 14 range, and we're reading 14.5, 14.6 right now in this truck, so we're in good shape. We need to check the windshield wipers for the examiner, so you put the windshield wipers on, tell them that the windshield wiper blades are functioning properly, nothing's loose or falling off, and put the washers on. Push the button, causing windshield washer fluid to squirt out on the windshield to prove that that's working. You want to check the windshield itself, make sure the windshield is not cracked, broken, and doesn't have any illegal stickers. You want to check your mirrors, make sure that the mirrors are clean and properly adjusted. If not described earlier, make sure you tell them they're not cracked, broken, or missing. We do need to show him the heater defroster controls. You need to put the controls in the defrost position, turn the fan on, put your hand up here, and tell him that you feel the air blowing up on the windshield to defrost the windshield. Turn the heat on, put it onto the floor, put your hand down here, tell the examiner, yes, I'm getting heat down on my feet on the floorboard. So the heater and defroster are working. We need to check our emergency equipment. This is our fire extinguisher. It is properly rated, it is charged and securely mounted. Here are our reflective triangles that are required. They are mounted in this box, ready to be used when necessary. And we are to carry fuses. I carry the extra fuses right there. If your vehicle has circuit breakers, then you don't need to carry the fuses. The examiner also wants you to show him where the horn is, that it's working. This truck simply has the electric horn. It has no air horn. Many of our trucks do have an air horn up here. All you need to do is honk the electric horn. You don't need to honk the air horn. And please don't honk the air horn when it's cold in the winter, because it could freeze open and create an air leak. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to check to make sure that the parking brakes are securely holding the vehicle. So with the parking brakes on, I'm going to put it in drive. I'm going to lightly touch the throttle to make sure that the vehicle doesn't move. And then I'd like to isolate both of these. So I'm going to leave the parking brake for the tractor on in the out position, push the trailer brake in. Again, it's still in drive. I'm going to touch the throttle just a little bit, make sure that the truck doesn't move. That means the tractor brakes are holding firm. Next, I want to check the trailer brakes. I'm going to pull the trailer brake out. That's the red button. I'm going to push the yellow one in, releasing the brakes on the tractor. And again, I'm going to touch the throttle lightly, just to make sure that the trailer brakes are working. And then very importantly, the other thing that this does is that it ensures that our locking jaws are locked on the kingpin, securely attaching the truck and trailer together. Make sure you explain that to the examiner, and I would recommend that you use this motion with your hands to clearly convince the examiner you know what you're talking about, that doing this, trailer brake on, tractor brake off, attempting to pull forward, checks not only trailer brakes, but also trailer connection. Next, we want to check our service brake. The service brake is the foot brake. So, we push the trailer brake in. What I'm going to do is move forward. They want you to go 5 miles an hour and then stop the truck. So I'm going to pull forward, stop the truck after reaching 5 miles an hour, tell the examiner that the pedal felt firm, the wheel did not pull left or right, the truck stopped straight. Now I go into what we call the air brake check. Now this is a very important part of the test. After you have pulled forward and stopped, you're going to go into the air brake check. Keep your foot on the brake pedal. Keep the parking brakes released. Turn the key off to kill the motor. Turn the key back on so that the gauges are working. Now to do the air brake check, it's very important that you do the following. You must turn the fan off. Heat in the winter, air conditioning in the summer. You must roll the window down, at least a little bit. and then you must tell the examiner that while looking for air leaks for a minute, remember for Class A you can only lose 4 pounds of pressure in 1 minute. For Class B it's 3 pounds, but for Class A it's 4 pounds of pressure maximum air loss in 1 minute. But you must tell the examiner that you're also listening for the leaks along with watching the air gauge to make sure you're not losing more than that 4 pounds of pressure. So these 3 things are very important to this air brake check. Turn the fan down, roll the window down, tell the examiner that you're listening and looking for air leaks. Fan down, window down, listening and looking for air leaks. 4 pounds maximum in 1 minute. Some of our trucks do have a little timer in them. You can time it mentally. What I like to do is use my fingers and just kind of mentally count, okay? So I'm mentally counting, that was 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and you count all the way up to 60 seconds. Now, the examiner will help you with that timing if you ask him for it, but it's important that you understand to time it for 1 minute, not less, not more. There's a few seconds of wiggle room there. But we've had students fail the test because they just keep waiting. Now, the examiner's not going to tell you when the minute is up unless you have specifically asked him to help you with it, okay? All right, you're watching the air gauge. You're not allowed to lose more than 4 pounds in 1 minute. After checking for the air loss over a period of 1 minute of time, the next thing I want to do is check for my low air warning signal to operate properly. Now, I've got about 125 pounds of air pressure in the truck right now, and the motor is off with the key on. Foot's on the brake, the brakes are released. And what I'm going to do now is pump the brake pedal to get the air pressure to come down. The low air warning signal, which is a light and or buzzer, are to come on between 60 and 80 pounds of pressure. So I'm going to prove that that works. So rapidly pumping the brake pedal, I'm getting the air pressure to come out of the truck. Now you see I've got a light and a buzzer. And it came on in this indication just under 80 pounds on both of these gauges. So that's perfect. It can come on at 60, that's fine. Just somewhere between 60 and 80. All right, that's my low air warning signal. Next thing I want to do is make sure that these emergency brakes pop on correctly by continuing to bleed the air pressure out of the truck by pumping the brake pedal. These two should pop between 20 and 40 pounds of pressure. Now, on most trucks, the trailer will pop first, a slight delay to the yellow button popping out. Some trucks it'll be rather simultaneous. So I'm going to pump the brakes. We'll see what this truck does. Now you see they both popped out rather simultaneously. Again, some trucks this will pop first and there's a delay. Make absolutely certain that you continue to pump until that button also pops out. They both have to pop out. Then you point out your air gauge and tell the examiner, yep, the air pressure popped, in this case, just above 25 pounds of pressure, which is correct because it has to pop between 20 and 40 pounds of pressure. Now we need to start the truck up and build pressure again. When you do that, if you see that ABS light again pointed out, sometimes people will forget it when you initially did the safe start. If you pick it up when you do this, you'll still get full credit. Now, in Wisconsin, they don't require you to check to make sure that the emergency brakes are holding, but if you're taking a test in Minnesota, they would require that at this point. You put it in drive, touch the throttle again to prove that the emergency brakes are working. Now, to build up air pressure, it's extremely important you remember to put the truck in neutral to build up air pressure. To expedite building up air pressure in a shorter amount of time, in neutral, only in neutral, we increase engine RPM up to about 1500 RPM, and that will allow us to build our air pressure quicker. Now you'll notice that the light and buzzer is going to go off at about 80 pounds of pressure. When that goes off, you continue to build up air pressure until you get all the way up to 125 pounds. you'll hear a purging of air underneath the truck that indicates when you have reached maximum pressure. At that point, you're ready to drive. In Minnesota, they would require an additional trailer tug to check trailer connection at that point. Now, any of you testing in Minnesota will give you specific instructions on that, but you Wisconsin drivers, or those of you testing in Wisconsin, regardless of what state you come from, don't have to check the trailer connection at this point. It's already been done. That completes your pre-trip inspection. This needs to be practiced, practiced, practiced in order to be able to perform this to a level of proficiency so that you pass the test the first time. Remember, the air brake check is what needs to be done perfectly in order, those three things. And that's why we have trucks available for you to practice that process. Let us know if you have any questions. Use the audio file, use your flashcards, use the workbook, use the checklist, and practice, practice, practice. I'm Bill Collins, Hudson Truck Driving School. Thanks for taking the journey with me. Have a good day, but most important, have a safe day.